I heard his confession every Sunday for 14 months before I understood what I was actually listening to. That is the part that stays with me even now, decades later, sitting in this chair with my hands folded in my lap and the particular quiet of very old age surrounding me like water. 14 months of Sundays. 14 months of that same voice coming through the wooden grill of the confessional in the Church of St. Jadwiga. Low and precise and carrying beneath its formal contrition something else entirely. Something that took me 14 months to recognize because I had spent 30 years training myself not to listen to confessions the way an intelligence officer listens to a debriefing. I had trained myself to listen the way God listens, with patience and without judgment, and with complete attention to the soul rather than the information. That training very nearly cost 300 resistance fighters their lives. And then I turned it into the most effective intelligence operation in our entire region for the remaining 2 years of the occupation. My name is Sister Veronika Stawarska, and I was the confessor's assistant at St. Jadwiga from 1942 until the liberation. And what I did in that confessional was simultaneously the greatest sin and the greatest act of service I have ever committed. I have made my peace with that contradiction. It took 40 years, but I made it. You need to understand what my life looked like before the war reshaped it into something unrecognizable. I had entered the Convent of the Immaculate Heart in Poznan at 22, young enough that the world outside still felt like something I had chosen to leave rather than something that had been taken from me. I had studied languages before taking my vows, French and German, and a working Latin that proved more useful than anyone anticipated, and I brought those languages into the convent the way you bring childhood into adulthood, not as tools exactly, but as part of the architecture of how you think. My German was precise. Native speakers told me this. My accent carried no trace of Polish origin, which is rarer than you might imagine, and which is a gift I did not fully appreciate until 1942, when appreciating it became a matter of survival for people who were not me. The Convent of the Immaculate Heart was requisitioned in 1941. The Germans took the main building for administrative offices and allowed the sisters to remain in the East Wing, which was smaller and colder and overlooked the courtyard where staff cars came and went at all hours. We were permitted to continue our work at St. Jadwiga, the parish church 2 streets away, because the Germans had decided that maintaining the appearance of religious tolerance in occupied Poznan served their administrative purposes better than the alternative. This was their calculation. My calculation, which I arrived at slowly over the following year, was different. Father Tomasz, our parish priest, was 73 years old, and his hearing had been declining for a decade. By 1942, it had declined to the point where conducting confession had become genuinely difficult for him, not impossible, but uncertain in the way that worried us both. The Germans who attended Sunday Mass at St. Jadwiga, and there were always some officers and administrative staff who maintained the performance of Catholic observance the way they maintained other performances of normalcy, would sometimes request confession afterward. Father Tomasz heard these confessions as he heard all confessions, with pastoral patience and without comprehension of perhaps a third of what was said to him. He would lean toward the grill, and his expression would remain steady and compassionate, and occasionally he would offer absolution for sins he had not fully heard, which troubled him enormously, and which he confided to me one evening in the sacristy with a distress that was completely genuine. He asked me if I would sit in the small preparation room adjacent to the confessional during his sessions with the German congregants, available to translate quietly through the interior connecting panel if he signaled that he had missed something. He framed it as pastoral assistance. I accepted it as exactly that. For approximately 8 Sundays, it was exactly that, and nothing more. The Sunday that changed everything was in March 1942. The officer who entered the confessional that morning was a Hauptmann named Werner Brückner, who had been attending Mass at St. Jadwiga for several months. He was perhaps 38, precise in his movements, the kind of man who irons his private correspondence. His confessions until that point had been formulaic, the minor sins of a man who considered himself fundamentally decent, and was using the confessional to maintain that self-image rather than to genuinely examine his conscience. But on that Sunday in March, something had shifted in him. He spoke for a long time. Father Tomasz signaled to me twice, which meant he had lost the thread of the German. and I translated in a murmur through the connecting panel, rendering Bruckner's words into Polish for the old priest on the other side. And what I translated stopped my breath completely. Bruckner was confessing to knowledge, not to an action, but to knowledge. He knew that a roundup of resistance members was planned for the following Thursday. He knew the addresses, he knew the names, he had seen the list on his commanding officer's desk, and he had done nothing to warn anyone, and his conscience, which was more functional than his self-image had suggested, was making him pay for that silence in the only currency available to it, which was this Sunday morning in this wooden box with an old priest who could barely hear him. He wanted absolution for his inaction. He wanted to confess that he had known and said nothing, and he wanted someone with the authority of God to tell him it was forgiven. Father Tomasz gave him his absolution. I sat in the preparation room with my hand pressed over my mouth and my mind moving faster than it had moved since before I took my vows. I had just heard, through the seal of the confessional, information that would save lives. Information I was forbidden by every sacred principle of my faith to repeat to any living person. The seal of confession is absolute. It is not a guideline. It is not a preference. It is the foundational guarantee that makes the entire sacrament possible. And breaking it is among the gravest violations a person in my position can commit. I knew this. I had known it since my first days in formation. I sat in that small room and I argued with God for the remaining hour of that Sunday morning, and by the time I walked back to the convent, I had not resolved the argument, but I had made my decision. I contacted the resistance through a woman named Irina Kwiatkowska, who sold vegetables from a cart outside the convent gate 3 mornings a week and who was not only selling vegetables. I told her nothing about the confessional. I told her I had overheard German officers speaking in the street and that there was to be a roundup on Thursday, and I had partial information about targets. This was a lie constructed around a truth, which I recognized as a category of deception I would have to account for eventually, and which I chose to account for later rather than now, because later was a luxury that the people on that list did not have. The resistance acted on my information. The roundup on Thursday found empty apartments and confused German soldiers and not a single resistance member because they had all moved the previous Wednesday night. I will not tell you that what I did next was righteous. I will tell you that it was deliberate. Over the following weeks, I reorganized my understanding of what I was doing in that preparation room, and I reorganized it without self-deception, which is the only honest way to reorganize anything. I was gathering intelligence. I was using the confessional, the most sacred private space in Catholic life, as an intelligence asset. I was doing this because German officers who maintained Catholic observance were, in that confessional, more honest than they were anywhere else in their lives, because the confessional promised them something the rest of the world did not: genuine absolution, genuine privacy, genuine listening without consequence. They told Father Tomasz things they told no one else, and Father Tomasz, bless his failing ears and his genuine pastoral heart, could not fully hear them. But I could. I developed a method across the following months that I am not proud of in its mechanics, but which I cannot regret in its outcomes. I created a notation system, a personal shorthand that I could write without looking at the paper, recording what I heard through the connecting panel while appearing to any observer who somehow entered that preparation room to be engaged in private prayer. Dates, locations, names, unit movements, supply routes, planned operations. The officers who confessed at St. Jadwiga were not the highest-ranking men in Poznan, but they were men with access to operational information, and operational information from multiple sources, combined and cross-referenced, builds a picture that no single source can provide. I was building that picture every Sunday and passing it to Irina Kwiatkowska in methods that became increasingly refined as the months accumulated. A folded note tucked beneath the weekly vegetable order. A particular arrangement of items on the convent shopping list that indicated the category of information I had gathered. Once, memorably, a message written in onion juice on the paper wrapping of a parcel of carrots that Irina steamed open and read and then destroyed, because invisible ink sounds romantic until you consider that someone has to steam open a parcel of carrots every week, and Irina was not a woman who found romance in inconvenience. The closest I came to discovery was in November 1943. A new officer began attending confession, younger than most of the others, perhaps 26, with the particular combination of intelligence and ideological commitment that made the younger SS officers the most dangerous category of person in occupied Poland. His name was Lieutenant Dieter Hausch, and he was suspicious in the professional sense, meaning that suspicion was his primary mode of engaging with the world, rather than a response to specific evidence. He came to confession twice before he came to see Father Tomasz privately, and in that private meeting he expressed his concern that the confessional at St. Jadwiga might not be fully sealed, that the preparation room adjacent might allow sound to pass through. Father Tomasz, who was genuinely innocent of everything I was doing, assured him with complete sincerity that the confessional met every canonical standard of privacy. Hausch left apparently satisfied. I sat in the convent kitchen that evening and understood for the first time with my full body rather than simply my mind how close the line was that I was walking. I adjusted my methods after Hausch. I moved further from the connecting panel. I wrote less and remembered more, relying on the archival memory I had developed across years of library work, the ability to hold a complex sequence of information intact across hours, and then render it accurately on paper afterward. It was more demanding and less precise, but it was safer, and safety had stopped being a personal concern and become an operational one because if I was discovered, the network I was feeding would lose its primary source, and people would die for that loss in ways that my own execution would only begin to account for. The liberation came in January 1945, and with it the end of the Sundays that had defined my life for 2 years and 8 months. The German officers who had knelt in that confessional and offered their consciences to Father Tomasz's pastoral care and their operational knowledge to my notation system were gone, retreating west with the remainder of the occupation apparatus. Father Tomasz died in March 1945, 2 months after the liberation, of the pneumonia that had been threatening him since the previous winter. He died without knowing what had happened in the preparation room beside his confessional across those 2 years and 8 months. I am glad of that. His ignorance was genuine, and his ministry was genuine, and the absolution he gave those officers was genuine because he gave it in complete good faith, and I did not want my actions to retroactively corrupt something that had been, on his side of the wooden grill, entirely pure. I made my full confession to a bishop in Warsaw in the summer of 1945. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which took considerable time. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something I have carried with me for the 50 years since that conversation. He said that the seal of confession exists to protect the sanctity of the relationship between a soul and God, and that I had not broken that seal because I had never been the confessor, I had been the translator, and translation is interpretation, and interpretation contains the interpreter, and what I had interpreted in that preparation room was not the sacred communication between a soul and its creator, but the moral consequence of that communication reaching a world that desperately needed it. I do not know if his theology was sound. I know that it was merciful. And I know that the 287 resistance members who did not die in roundups that were redirected, disrupted, or abandoned because of information that moved from that confessional through my notation system to Irina's vegetable cart and into the hands of people who could act on it, I know that they lived. I know their names, many of them. I kept that list too. I have kept it for 50 years, and I will keep it until I cannot keep anything anymore. It is the only record I have ever maintained that I am entirely certain needed to exist. Everything else can be argued. That list cannot.